The Union of Canadian Correctional Officers is launching today a campaign calling for national measures to help correctional officers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder all across the country. To raise awareness on this important issue, we are releasing Working on the Edge, a powerful film showing the realities and dangers correctional officers face on a daily basis. Filmed at the now-closed Kingston Penitentiary, this film depicts a day in the life of correctional officers through reenactments of real events and interviews. The correctional officers who appear in the film and who are with us today have demonstrated exemplary courage in choosing to speak openly about the mental health issues they have faced as a result of the traumatic experiences they endured. We have with us Joanne Rutley from Ontario Region, Eric Enger from the Pacific Region, Marc Filiatreau from the Quebec Region, and Justin Kelch from the Prairies Region. We are releasing the film on our website and on our YouTube channel as we speak, and the film will also be shown to members of Parliament on Parliament Hill this afternoon at 5 p.m. The campaign we are launching today is an important one. Correctional officers are first responders behind the walls. Inside penal institutions, we are the policemen, the paramedics, and the firefighters. In 2014-2015, correctional officers were required to use force 1,500 times and made over 7,500 contraband seizures. Each year, correctional officers perform nearly 2,000 medical interventions. As a result of being exposed to traumatic events, a high rate of correctional officers suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Approximately 30% of correctional officers report having experienced PTSD, according to the recent data from Public Safety Canada. We are here today because we want the federal government to take action. We want Public Safety Canada to recognize PTSD as an operational stress injury. We want the federal government to establish a national treatment center for federal first responders, which includes correctional officers. We want the federal government to convene a federal provincial meeting on the recognition of post-traumatic stress among first responders, including correctional officers. In the context of this meeting, we are asking the federal government to propose the adoption of provincial legislation that contains the presumption of operational stress injuries for first responders, and that this legislation be consistent from one province to the next. These are all recommendations that come from the report on the Standing Committee on Public Safety that was released 1 year ago today. I now refer to my colleague.
Bonjour, merci d'être venu en grand nombre.
Thank you for being here. The Union of Canadian Correctional Officers is launching today a campaign calling for national measures to help correctional officers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder all across the country. To raise awareness on this important issue, today we are releasing Working on the Edge, a powerful film showing the realities and dangers correctional officers face on a daily basis. Filmed at the now-closed Kingston Penitentiary, this film depicts a day in the life of correctional officers through reenactments of real events and interviews. The correctional officers who appear in the film and who are with us today have demonstrated exemplary courage in choosing to speak openly about the mental health issues they have faced as a result of the traumatic experiences they endured. We have with us Joanne Rutley from the Ontario region, Eric Enger from the Pacific region, Marc Filiatreau from the Quebec region, Justin Kelch from the Prairies region. We are releasing the film on our website and our YouTube channel as we speak, and the film will also be shown to members of Parliament on Parliament Hill this afternoon at 5 p.m. The campaign we are launching today is an important one. Correctional officers are first responders behind the walls. Inside penal institutions, we are the policemen, the paramedics, and the firefighters. In 2014-2015, correctional officers were required to use force 1,500 times and made over 7,500 contraband seizures. Each year, correctional officers perform nearly 2,000 medical interventions. As a result of being exposed to traumatic events, a high rate of correctional officers suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Approximately 30% of correctional officers report having experienced PTSD, according to recent data from Public Safety Canada. We are here today because we want the federal government to take action. We want Public Safety Canada to recognize PTSD as an operational stress injury. We want the federal government to establish a national treatment center for federal first responders, which includes correctional officers. We want the federal government to convene a federal provincial meeting on the recognition of PTSD among first responders, including correctional officers. In the context of this meeting, we are asking the federal government to propose the adoption of provincial legislation that contains the presumption of operational stress injuries for first responders, and that this legislation be consistent from one province to the next. These are all recommendations that come from the report of the Standing Committee on Public Safety that was released a year ago. Thank you for being here, and we're now ready to take your questions.
First, show the trailer. So we're going to show the trailer.
I think by my 6th month in was when I saw my first murder.
Lock down! Get back in your cell! Get back in!
Okay, son, call an ambulance! We're gonna get you. Yeah, please come in.
Au début, après le premier pendu, j'avais des troubles d'insomnie. J'avais constamment l'impression...
I couldn't sleep afterwards.
I knew that I never was going to be able to erase that from my mind. Never.
Look at me, talk to me. Do you have any kids? Okay, come on. How many kids do you have?
I used to be a pretty funny guy. Good time. I don't know if I am anymore. It just wears on you.
How are you?
Oh, I'm not too bad.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Good night?
Well, I think I'm starting the flu, so we're a little nervous about that.
Everybody always good. You guys?
Okay.
I had to fill out an incident report on O'Reilly. He's going before the parole board next week.
Hey, boss. Hey, Mr. Garfield. What's up?
Okay, I'm now going to turn it over to questions. First, we'll be hearing from Raymond Fillion from TVA.
Oui, bonjour. Le film s'intitule
Yes, good afternoon. The title of the film is Working on the Edge, but can you tell us exactly what this means? What conditions cause PTSD among correctional officers? Well, it's often a big event. It can be a big event, or can it be a series of small events that correctional officers experience in their workplace. In the video, you see an example of a serious case, a riot, or you may find an inmate who has hanged himself. So these are the kinds of instances that these officers face in the course of their career. Have you had discussions with the government with respect to your demands? Yes, we appeared before the Public Safety Committee of Canada. We discussed this issue with them. We often talk about it. We've just come out of an information campaign in order to ensure that we have the same legislation right across the country. And what has been the government's response? They're actually quite receptive to this. Yes, I have a question with respect to legislation across the country. Are provinces dragging their feet in terms of bringing in this kind of legislation? Are some provinces doing better than others? Well, what's important, really, is that we're looking at a presumption. That's important. In Ontario, we do have legislation on presumption that facilitates access to care. Now, in Quebec, there is no presumption, so access is much more difficult to get through the different levels of the CSST, and therefore it's more problematic to have access to care if people are suffering from PTSD. So basically the presumption is that it's a dangerous job and that this sort of thing is an occupational injury, possibly.
Just in that video, can you just talk about the drive behind what you're doing and sort of the timeline and how this all kind of comes together with help from the feds? And I'm not sure you touched on the provincial government and kind of how that all ties together.
Well, I mean, for us, the timeline, again, we're looking to lobby the provincial governments to move to the presumptive legislation. The report from the Public Safety Committee with the 15 recommendations has now been sitting for a year in the minister's hands, and so part of our goal now is to try to revive that and get things moving. There's some key recommendations in there that we're after. Obviously, the presumptive piece is one, and a national treatment center for first responders. Really, the time to act is now. The statistics are there to back up that correctional officers and other first responders are suffering from very high rates of post-traumatic stress. So it's time for the government to start funding, to put some money where it is. It's one thing to talk about it, but we've talked enough about it now, and now it's time to move it forward, some of those recommendations.
You guys mentioned a lot of stats in your announcement. Are there any alarming numbers that kind of jump out to you as to why this is such an urgent matter for you? You mentioned a bunch of numbers about over 14 and 15 different instances that correctional officers attended to. Anything that kind of really jumps out in your mind? Well,
I mean, statistically, if you look at as an example, the number of medical interventions, I mean, that's almost six a day if you do the stats. And obviously, you know, we were looking at the number of use of force incidents at 1,500 a year. So those are pretty staggering statistics. And if you look at, in terms of the PTSD rates amongst correctional officers, they put us well over 30%. Without disrespecting our paramedic colleagues and firefighters and police officers, we actually top the list. Stress for correctional officers is cumulative, and we see numerous incidents every year, and the stats are there to back that up. So.
I'm Christy Kirkup from Canadian Press, so I'm going to give myself a question.
Sure.
You mentioned that you're going to be meeting with parliamentarians today, specifically with one of the asks being a national treatment center. Do we have any idea of how much federal funding such a center would require, what the price tag would be, and why is it critical for the federal government to earmark money for that very purpose?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a task force that's now looking at that. There is a little bit of funding now coming from Public Safety Canada. The issue really is preparing a business case now for the government, and that's now underway. So that is a bit encouraging, but you can't put a price tag on people's mental health. Quite frankly, the sooner that we treat correctional officers or any first responders and have treatment programs set up and the funding there to do that, the sooner those individuals can get back to work and start to work in a normal, semi-normal environment again. So cost, quite frankly, there should be no cost on someone's mental health. For us, the cost savings for the government will come later on, just with the simple fact that these individuals are able to go back and do their job. So this is in the infancy stages, and this is what we're saying is we need to move this along. The time is now, and currently there's a business case being prepared in terms of the dollars.
And just another question. I'm not asking you to speak for the correctional officers, who I know there are a number that are in the room. I know that you're advocating on their behalf, of course. Issues that happen within institutions, I think sometimes are, in the public where we don't get to see a window into that world. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if one of the overarching points that you've heard from correctional officers is that they feel forgotten about, or that their experience isn't heard, and to what extent are you trying to bring that into the light?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, we are the forgotten about first responders. I mean, simply put, there's no glamour in our job in the public eye. If you're, I know situations where officers, as an example, have, we are both correctional officers as well, but, they've intervened and saved lives of inmates, but the public generally is not sympathetic. If I save the life of somebody in downtown Toronto, I'm probably going to be hailed as a hero, but if I save the life of an inmate, the public doesn't see it that way. People don't really realize that we're actually doing all three of those first responders roles behind the walls of a penal institution, and I think that's part of what we're trying to do is explain to people, look, we are that forgotten about, out of sight, out of mind group, and given the numbers that we have in terms of PTSD, we can't be forgotten about anymore. We need to move forward, start helping first responders. We are first responders behind the walls, and start helping correctional officers.
Yes, Chris.
Une autre question de suivi, c'est au niveau.
My follow-up question has to do with the situation now. In 2017, there's a lot of talk about mental health issues. And why is it important for you for there to be action now? Has the problem gotten worse in recent years? Has it become greater in magnitude? Well, if you look at the statistics on PTSD among correctional officers, the figures are there. And what really stunned us was the number of people affected by this. And we think it's important to talk about it. We are human beings. We work under very difficult conditions. And that's what's important. We have to break the wall of silence, and we have to get out there and get help and care for these individuals. Is there a certain amount of stigma associated with mental health issues? Is there a kind of a principle of omerta among correctional officers? Yes, they kind of think of themselves as super people, super women, super men. Now, there are more men than women, and very often people don't want to talk about their feelings. They have greater trouble trying to breaking that wall of silence. So that's part of our reality. It's something we're working to change now. Now, do officers have access to mental health care through their work? Is there infrastructure in place to help them already? Well, Correctional Services Canada has an employee assistance program, which is fairly limited in terms of the care you can receive. After that, people are pretty much left to their own devices in their own province to get the care they need. There's no predefined program with respect to PTSD among correctional officers. Why do you say that you are the forgotten first responders? Well, basically, in a penitentiary, in a federal institution, it's really like a small town, a small city. Nobody comes in or goes out. We are firefighters. If there is a fire that starts inside, we have to come and deal with it. If there's a security incident or if there's first aid to be given, we are the ones that are there to do that. So we are firefighter. We do all of those things. We do what we need to do in terms of security and safety. We apply the disciplinary regime, and we're police officers and firefighters all at once. People often think of the kind of Hollywood films such as Prison Break, but that's not our reality at all. That's not what we do on a daily basis inside the federal institutions.
For a correctional officer in a federal institution, how much mental health support is there a cap on how much that person could receive, or what might be available to them?
Yeah, there are caps. I mean, we do have employee assistance programs. We've now embarked on the Road to Mental Readiness, which is a training, a resilience training for correctional officers. So there are some initiatives, there, but there is a certain cap through our insurance plans as well. And we just think that, look, in order to treat these properly, the cases that we have, there shouldn't be any cost to this. Again, we go back to it. I mean, I always make the reference to the former General Romeo Dallaire, who says we spend millions of dollars fixing up our military equipment when we come back from missions overseas, but we spend virtually nothing on the troops. So can there be a lot more done and a lot more funding? Absolutely. So we need more programs. We need specific programs for correctional officers. We need a treatment center that we can go to, that we can turn to, because oftentimes we don't have a lot of options available to us. So there's all of those aspects there that need to be looked at. And yes, sometimes there is a cap. The reason why we want the presumptive legislation is so we don't have someone who's diagnosed with PSD fighting through the appeal process to get his claims through to recognize that it's an occupational stress injury. Because what happens is the individual who is already isolated, that doesn't help the situation to begin with, and they may be sitting there fighting for a year to get their appeal through, and they're usually alone and they're not receiving treatment. So if this is why we're lobbying the provincial governments to go with the presumptive, so that we can have that treatment right away and that it's funded and looked after.
But specifically for the federal government, because again, we're in Ottawa, you're meeting with parliamentarians for the federal focus. I'm just wondering as well for federal correctional institutions, do we have a picture of, I know this is a general question, but is the situation worsening given the, what people are dealing with in the video? There, was mention of witnessing a murder, or people, are the situations behind the prison walls, is that worsening?
Well, it continues to be a problem. I mean, I think the stats speak for themselves. I mean, is the problem worsening? Well, certainly the problem isn't going away, and it's not really, being reduced. The only positive light we have seen, as an example, in the Ontario and Manitoba models, where they've gone with the presumptive legislation. So we're seeing a little bit of results there, where those two provinces have stepped up to the plate. So now we have some people that are suffering from occupational stress injuries that, based on the diagnosis from their doctor that they are suffering from PTSD, they're being treated right away. So this is a good news story. But there's a lot more work to be done. I mean, we're still, as federal correctional officers, we need the government to bring those provinces together to have something that's consistent across the board, because it's inconsistent all across Canada. And sometimes correctional officers in Alberta, as an example, they're not subject to the presumptive legislation. So again, they end up fighting their claims and appeals. So we need the government to put some pressure, or to put some money into the provinces to say, look, let's make this consistent for first responders, and let's treat them right away.
Are there any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This concludes the press conference.
Thank you very much.